Hello, thank you very much for joining this session today. My name is Ivana Rossi, and I work at the Financial Integrity Group at the IMF's Legal Department. Today, I want to share with you a measure to combat corruption and illicit flows that we have been encouraging since the beginning of the pandemic. As you all probably remember very well, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all struggling to adapt to this sudden new reality, having to stay at home and social distancing, homeschooling, and we were also desperately trying to secure basic supplies like masks and hand sanitizers, and not to mention toilet paper. We were all doing this, but we were not the only ones. The pandemic also forced governments to go on a shopping spree, trying to secure, as fast as possible, protective equipment, medical supplies, expand hospital capacity. But that was not all. They also had to increase spending in social assistance and subsidies, and things such as expanding the infrastructure for online education. So the range of issues that demanded urgent attention is very broad and very expensive. Currently, it's actually estimated in $11.5 trillion since the beginning of the pandemic. So as a result, a lot of fund members came seeking emergency financing to help them tackle some of these COVID-related challenges. A lot of things changed with the pandemic. Unfortunately, that is not the case with corruption. As a matter of fact, the crisis makes it even worse, as it provides many opportunities to take advantage of the urgent situation. We have all seen in newspapers from around the world cases of overpriced masks or multi-million-dollar contracts that were given to companies linked to a friend or to political connections, or that do not necessarily have enough experience to supply those goods and services. The numbers of public resources that could be lost to corruption during this pandemic are daunting, and the human cost simply staggering. Underlying these corruption allegations are very important questions. Do governments really know who they're buying from? Can we really tell how this money is being spent? These are the kind of questions that motivated the design of the measure that I'd like to discuss today. These questions led us to encourage countries to implement a new take on existing transparency tools. So let's dive deeper into the COVID challenges and the transparency tools that are part of this new take. Government purchasing of goods and services is called procurement. Even under normal circumstances, procurement is an activity with a high risk of corruption because it involves millions of dollars every year. For example, the OECD calculated a few years ago that 13% of the GDP of OECD countries is spent yearly on procurement. It also calculated that up to 43% of the cost of each individual contract could be lost to corruption. So, procurement is always at risk of corruption, and COVID-19 urgencies took the level of concern and spending to a whole new level. Why? Because urgent spending translates into accelerated procurement processes. And by accelerated, I don't mean that they're happening faster. What happens is that some of the controls and safeguards that are part of a procurement process have to be relaxed. And they have to maybe engage in direct contract awards or shortening the submission periods for these bids, or tailor specifications differently because they have to do it faster. So the urgency and the relaxing of these controls, unfortunately, really increases opportunities for corruption. Corruption understood as maybe bid rigging, that you're favoring a specific company, that you want that company to win, or that there's bribes or kickbacks involved in the procurement process, or that there's conflict of interest. For a long time, procurement transparency has been considered a fundamental tool to reduce corruption at the same time make sure that the procurement process is competitive and fair for everyone involved. By transparency, what I mean is a series of measures that focus on making information available across the different steps of the procurement process from the beginning to the end to make it more accountable. For example, you could have a website where all the companies that want to participate in the procurement process can see what are the bids that are open, what are their requirements, the timeline, and maybe towards the end of the process, we can access the actual contracts that were signed in some cases. Thanks to this open information, we can all see what is happening. For instance, an NGO recently, thanks to open data, analyzed the contracts since the beginning of the pandemic for their country and realized that 30% of the companies that were awarded contracts could be labeled as multi-purpose. What this means is that one day they're building a hospital and the next day they're providing food kits for schools. There's nothing wrong with this. The question is, do these companies really have the expertise or the capacity to be doing both things? It's an important question. So we've long known that procurement transparency is fundamental. However, the progress in reaching that transparency is very slow. A recent report from Open Contracting Standards reports that yearly, at the global level, $13 trillion are spent on procurement. Yet, only 3% of those contracts are published openly. So we know procurement transparency is fundamental, but the key underlying questions are still there. Do we really know who is behind the companies that our governments are contracting with? And this is why we wanted to go one step further. We wanted transparency of the companies, transparency of the entities that are providing these goods and services. And when we ask about who is behind, we're not talking about the name of the company or who is the director of that company or the shareholder. What we're talking about is the beneficial owner of that company, the person that really controls, owns, or benefit that company. You all remember the Panama Papers and some other similar leaks. And through them, we learned that actually identifying the beneficial owner can be very difficult. Why? Because companies sometimes are structured in a very clever way, to disguise who is at the end of that chain. So basically, it's very hard and it's very obscure to be able to know who is that person behind benefiting or controlling that company. To put this in perspective, for instance, the World Bank analyzed a few years ago 150 grant corruption cases from around the world. In 85% of those cases, companies had been misused, and it was hard to know who was the beneficial owner behind. So this is a true concern. And for those of us like me that work in anti-corruption and anti-money laundering, the concept of beneficial ownership is not new. And procurement transparency is also not new. What we realized in this pandemic, the new part, is that we realized that these two efforts were not being combined. Governments are constantly buying and procuring billions of dollars in goods and services from companies. And granted, most of the times they will ask for basic information from these companies, like the name of the director or the shareholders. But very rarely, they will try to identify the beneficial owner behind. This is not a common practice in procurement. So for us, that was a revelation. So this means that contracts could potentially be awarded to companies that look very legitimate, but in reality, they are not. So it could be a company that behind the beneficial owner is the spouse of a public official, or the cousin, or a friend, or even the public official herself, because she's obscuring that at the end of that legal chain, she's the actual beneficiary of the earnings of that company. So this is what is at the heart of this new take on transparency. This is what it's all about. We wanted to ensure that emergency resources that countries were seeking would truly be used for the intended purposes and reach those that really need it. So for this, we not only encourage countries to commit to traditional procurement transparency measures, we also started encouraging them to commit to publish the names of the companies that they were awarding procurement contracts and the beneficial owners. Since March 2020, 40 countries have committed to this measure. The good thing is, since it leverages existing frameworks from money laundering and from procurement transparency, the implementation of this measure is much simpler than it seems, and it can even be done in low-capacity countries. Simple as maybe it's just about asking the companies that want to be part of the procurement process to declare who their beneficial owners are. And yes, maybe all of those declarations of who is the beneficial owner will not always be accurate. But this is why it's so important that they're public. Because that way, civil society and investigative journalists can look at this data and raise flags if needed. Countries have already started implementing these measures. In those cases in which they found challenges, the IMF is providing technical assistance. And we hope that this measure will start really changing things. As we said, the ingredients were already there. Beneficial ownership, procurement transparency, these ingredients were already there. We just found a new way, a new recipe to combine them. And it will take time to see the impact of these measures. But we're very convinced that this new take on transparency can be an important step forward in the fight against corruption and illicit flows. So, going back to the virus, what I would say is, let's hope the virus stops spreading and we spread a lot more transparency. Thank you.